For the vast majority of Collins collectors, knowledge of Collins equipment produced before World War II is sparse. It's the post-war equipment produced from 1946 on that we all know and love. From the 32V1 and the 75A1 to the beginning of the single sideband era introduced with the KWS-1 and the 75A4, through the S-line to the KWM-380, to most of us, this is mainstream Collins radio. But the pre-war era is a particularly rich period in the company's history. The first 10 years of Collins radio, from 1933 to 1943, was, in my mind, the golden age of a new era in communications. This was a time in which the real achievements in pioneering a new technology were virtually everyday challenges, bringing a vast communications industry quickly to maturity. A time that separated the men from the boys and the survivors from the wannabes overnight. This was the decade in which the foundations were laid on which the next half-century of communications technology was built. During the first 10 years of Collins radio, approximately a dozen amateur transmitter models were produced. In the next 30 minutes, we'll look at some of these models and their progressive design evolution up to World War II. But first, it's worthwhile taking a brief look at the decade prior to the beginning of Collins radio, the Roaring Twenties. In 1921, Arthur Collins was 12 years old. Having been quite interested in radio since age 9, Arthur's knowledge of radio quickly evolved from the crystal set to the vacuum tube. In the spring of 1921, the recently formed Radio Corporation of America, thanks to the vast production capacities of its manufacturing partner, the General Electric Company, announced the widespread availability of an entirely new family of vacuum tubes and components for both receiving and transmitting. These components were described in detail in two landmark publications, Radio Apparatus for Amateur and Experimental Use and Radio Enters the Home, published a few months later. These components were featured extensively throughout popular radio publications thanks to RCA's sophisticated marketing efforts. By the time Arthur passed his amateur license examination at age 14, he was quite familiar with state-of-the-art vacuum tube technology. Its benefits over antiquated spark were obvious to the unbiased newcomer to the amateur radio game. In the summer of 1925, at age 15, Art became a national celebrity as the radio wonder boy, who was the only amateur able to maintain reliable communications with the Navy's Macmillan expedition to Greenland. For a 3-week period in August, 9CXX was the expedition's only contact with the world on 20 meters. So, what was the performance like of a 1921 vacuum tube transmitter? This transmitter was constructed from the RCA Radio Apparatus for Amateur and Experimental Use publication. It uses two Kenetron UV217 rectifiers and two UV203 50 watters as power oscillators. Modulation was accomplished using a magnetic modulator whose secondary winding was in series with the oscillation circuit, which, by the way, included the antenna. A carbon mic and bias battery were placed in the primary circuit. Typical characteristics of this popular design of the early 20s included shallow modulation, restricted and fuzzy audio, a large FM component, and general frequency instability. Other common problems facing the amateur of the 20s were cost. A single UV203 was $30. A companion power transformer was $38.50. A magnetic modulator, $12. Altogether, the components for this transmitter added up to $235. Considering inflation, that translates into thousands of today's dollars. Availability of transmitting parts was also limited. Commercial product availability was focused on receivers for the mushrooming broadcast market. Very few commercially produced amateur transmitters were available, and those that were typically beyond the reach of the average ham. Engineering know-how was also limited. The average amateur had very little exposure to formal electrical engineering training. Construction of a transmitter through popular publication articles was no guarantee of successful operation, let alone refinements. No safety discipline. In his passion for pioneering, the typical ham frequently overlooked many of the safety precautions we take for granted today. The average homebrew transmitter of the 20s was flat out dangerous. Exposed primary and high voltage components was a frequent source of life-shortening events for early hams. But perhaps the most challenging problem of the 20s were the new amateur laws. By the time the Radio Act of 1927 went into effect, the amateur bands at harmonic intervals as you and I know them were already established, and the amateur was removed from what was to become the high end of the exploding broadcast band. Operation at the higher shortwave frequencies was a whole new ballgame for amateur radio, demanding more sophisticated equipment designs. By 1932, the time was right for starting a company building transmitters. The amateur radio train had left the station. World records were being set on the new frequencies with the help of a new generation of screen grid receiving tubes, further fueling the demand for new transmitting equipment. The Great Depression had also forced the sale of the Collins family agriculture business, and for all practical purposes, Art had exhausted the resources of his electrical engineering instructors. Clearly, the time had come for action. By mid-1932, the Collins Transmitter Company had produced its first product. In September of 1933, Collins Radio was incorporated under Delaware laws. Art's key ingredients for a successful product line included leading-edge design. A 2-year product life expectancy was assumed given the fast pace of technology development. Cutting-edge technology isn't based on Me Too design. The use of high-quality components throughout. The reputation of a system builder obviously could only be built on the shoulders of its component suppliers. Reliable performance. No substitute for fulfilled expectations. Clean packaging. This included both safety aspects and aesthetics, as styling became a criteria for bringing the ham station into the family living quarters. Customer support, based on respect. According to Radio Enters the Home, in 1921, there were 25 times as many receivers as transmitters. For amateur radio, this ratio continued to widen throughout the 20s, but it was clear that it had to turn around and start heading toward parity as the demand for affordable transmitters increased during the frenzied, record-breaking heydays of the 30s. The very first assembled and tested Collins transmitter offered to the general amateur community, the 30W, was introduced in mid-1932. Based on modular building blocks, the 30W consisted of a 500AX power supply and a 10A RF chassis mounted in a sheet metal frame. An optional tuner unit was also offered. Each unit had a bakelite front panel attaching to a steel chassis. Although primitive in comparison to later Collins products, the hallmarks of Collins transmitter philosophy were established in its design. The 30W's black bakelite panels were crisp and clean, with a layout emphasizing convenience. Controls were clearly identified with engraved captions. Its most impressive feature was the row of 4 Weston 310 Bug-Eye surface-mounted meters adorning the power supply front panel. Above it, a plug-in crystal socket was located on the 10A front panel. A 10A crystal control unit used a 247 oscillator, a 247 buffer amp, and a 210 output. 3 plug-in coils were used in the oscillator, buffer, and output circuits. A fixed-turn magnetic coupling winding on the output coil was terminated to either the optional antenna coupling unit or 2 white porcelain cone insulators mounted on the rear brace that spanned the top of the frame. Later, the 10A RF deck was one of the basic building blocks of the 32B, the 40B, and the 150W and BW transmitters. In July of 1932, the 30W was introduced at a price of $95.60. However, by January 1933, the price had risen to $125. The 4A was Collins' answer to a low-cost basic CW transmitter that the average ham could justify, according to Collins' ads, due to the fact that the combined cost of the components were greater than the purchase price, $58.50, with 1 set of coils, less tubes. In 1933, however, this was still not inexpensive. The 4A was provided with a built-in power supply and used isolantite plug-in coils for each band. Sold as an option, a set of 2 was $5. Rated at 25 watts, it used a 47 oscillator driving parallel 46s. An 80 was used in the oscillator power supply as the low voltage rectifier, and an 83 as the high voltage rectifier. Early 4As had a bakelite front panel, while later production units had an aluminum panel painted with black wrinkle enamel. The meter was a 0 to 50 milliamp Weston in the early units and a Westinghouse model MX in later units. The 4A was the only low power product offering of the pre-war models. The 45A was perhaps one of the most popular transmitters of the mid to late 30s. While floor-standing transmitters were the norm for a medium-powered CW transmitter, the 45A was a sharp-looking, self-contained desktop transmitter running 120 watts CW and 40 watts phone. It measured 21 inches wide, 15 inches deep, 10 inches high, and weighed in at a mere 130 pounds. Installation involved simply connecting AC power, a key and/or microphone, and the antenna. Promoted as a powerful yet compact desktop transmitter, a real high-powered baby, November 35 QST, it was sold to amateurs, commercial users, and police departments. The 45A was a collection of pioneer works publicized in the trade magazines of the day. In the original 1935 model, the tube lineup was a Collins C100A driving a 46 buffer, driving an RK23, which in turn either drove an 830 multiplier or the C201 final. A later, 1937 model replaced the C100A oscillator with a 6L6 and the final with a 211H, which is a 211 with a plate cap. Rapid frequency change was accomplished by swapping out 2 plug-in frequency change assemblies. The first was an interchangeable frequency shift unit, an aluminum module that housed the crystal, the oscillator tank coil, and an optional multiplier coil. Banana pins mounted on its bakelite base on the bottom provided the electrical connections to the main chassis. The second frequency change module was the final tank assembly, which contained the driver coil cleverly positioned partially inside the final tank coil to do double duty as an inductive neutralization element as a legal workaround to capacitive neutralization. A rack and pinion provided adjustment means for obtaining the correct amount of inductive coupling. An output coupling coil wound with ribbon wire, a modified E.F. Johnson coil, was positioned on the outside of the final tank coil. The entire assembly was mounted on a Michael X base approximately 4 inches by 6 inches, fitted with banana plugs in the bottom, which mated with a mirroring Michael X plate mounted on standoffs above the chassis. The crystals Collins used were mounted in Collins-made crystal holders. These elegant porcelain and machined brass nickel-plated holders featured an adjustment screw at the top, under the round nomenclature tag, and were available heated and unheated. Both used a 5-pin base. The 45A had provisions for using heated crystals by adding a 6.3 volt filament transformer under the chassis. A front panel mounted red jeweled pilot lamp indicated operation of the thermostat. The 30FXC was introduced in 1936 as the successor to the popular 30FXB phone CW transmitter and was rated at 200 watts output on AM and CW and covered 1.5 to 30 megahertz. During this period, Collins was being threatened with a lawsuit by RCA, ATT, Westinghouse, and others, collectively known as the Radio Trust, over Collins' use of certain circuits, whom the trust owned the patents on, which were purchased from DeForest. Also at issue was the basic DeForest triode oscillator patent controlled by RCA. As a response, Collins partnered with Amprex to produce and brand its own tubes. The workaround on the critical oscillator patent was for Art Collins to secure the patent rights from Dr. Robert Goddard of liquid fuel rocket fame, who had obtained a patent on his unusual external grid vacuum tube in 1915. Collins developed its own oscillator circuit around this unique tube, having its grids on the outside of the glass envelope. Produced by Amprex and branded the C100A, this tube was actually somewhat quirky in its operation and likely required component tweaks to ensure reliable operation. Today, the C100 series tubes are among the rarest of the collectible Collins tubes. The C100A and the C100D were the only production versions of this unusual tube, with the B, C, and E being prototypes. In the 30FXC, the C100A drove a single 46 frequency multiplier or a second cascaded 46 multiplier, depending upon desired operating frequency. An RK20 intermediate amplifier fed the power tube, a Collins C201. The speech amplifier was built on the modulator chassis and was designed to accept the recently introduced crystal microphone. Yes, a D104. The modulators were RK31s, with 830Bs as alternates, operating Class B. The 30FXC used a total of 7 flush-mounted panel meters. 2 RF ammeters at the top were recessed from the front panel to reduce shunt capacity across the transmission line for more efficient operation at 30 MHz. The remaining 5 meters spanned the width of the transmitter just below the RF chassis and provided convenient monitoring of all critical current and voltage values. Plug-in coils were used for each band. The final tank assembly was a variation of the 45A tank coil assembly, but instead of the double-duty driver/inductive neutralization coil, a separate driver and neutralization coil were used. As with the 45A, the entire assembly was mounted on a Michael X base. The unit was 55 inches high, 13 inches deep, 19 inches wide, and weighed 260 pounds. It was finished in a black wrinkle enamel paint on the exterior and a smooth aluminum paint on the inside. A special RF section, the 10X, was offered for improved performance on the higher frequencies of 27 MHz and above. It's my opinion that the 30J is the crown jewel of the Collins pre-war transmitters. Never again in its history has Collins produced such an elegant transmitter for the amateur. Of the post-war models, only the 30K retained the basic style elements. The 30J was a general-purpose transmitter designed for general applications such as police service, aeronautical ground stations, or general point-to-point communications where service is intermittent. Announced in the November 37 issue of QST magazine, the ad stated, "It's our baby and we love it." And given the background of the ad was pink, we can assume it was a girl. The 30J was 40% more powerful than its predecessor, the 30FXC, rated at 250 watts out on phone and CW. 2 basic model types were built, differing mainly in tube lineups. The first 30J series included the Collins tubes, specifically the C100A oscillator, and a pair of C101 RF output tubes. The RF deck underwent a complete redesign using 7000 series plug-in coils employed in the 32RA in the low-level RF stages. The driver stage, a pair of 807s, used a plug-in shielded box to house its tank coils. The most radical redesign, however, was the output tuning chassis. Designed for low inductive and capacitive interaction with the plug-in tank coil, the entire frame was constructed from cast aluminum. It was mounted directly above the RF deck and provided easy access to the plug-in coils, which were wound on 2.5 inch by 6 inch coil forms. This assembly also appeared in the commercial 600A2, which was introduced a month after the 30J. The standard output was balanced, but a phasing coil option could be added to convert to unbalanced. By about 1938 or 39, the fences had been mended with RCA, and the 30J RF deck underwent a minor redesign to use more mainstream tubes, including the 802 in the oscillator assembly and a pair of 813s in the final. This model was designated the 30J18. The 30J18 used an 802 crystal oscillator stage feeding either an 807 frequency multiplier or a pair of 807 buffers, selectable, which drove the push-pull 813s. The modulators were a pair of ZB120s, similar to 838s but zero bias. Plug-in coils were used to set the desired frequency range, then tuned with trimmers or sliders to resonance. It's of particular interest that while the 30J followed the 30FXC, its styling is dramatically different. So different, in fact, that, in my opinion, there has never been a prettier Collins transmitter. My guess is that as part of Collins' strategy in making a serious effort to gain more broadcast market share, they engaged an industrial designer to do an across-the-board product facelift. The 30J was in the right place at the right time. Its distinct deco influence can also be seen on the Collins broadcast audio mixers and transmitters from about 1936 to 38. The unit measured 60 inches high, 20 inches wide, and 13 inches deep, and weighed 386 pounds. It was finished in a St. James gray crinkle and featured a hinged rear door, coil access window, and a meter panel mounted behind glass. All firsts for a Collins amateur transmitter. The designer of the 30J isn't confirmed. Some believe the electrical design was done by Merrill Smith, who later went on to manage the technical manuals department at Collins. Others disagree, but no one seems to remember definitively who it was. Today, sadly, the whereabouts of only a handful of the elegant 30Js are known. Now that you've seen a few of the Collins pre-war transmitters, I think you'll agree that, like the post-war products, the first decade models were clearly leadership products. In fact, it was these models that first established the Collins reputation and tradition. For the collector, acquiring one of these early transmitters can be quite challenging. However, the opportunity to experience it, like those lucky hams of our fathers and grandfathers' generation did, can be very rewarding.